The slave auction on Ethera Prime was always a grand affair, and the Volanthi nobility gathered in their finest robes to inspect the newest arrivals from the conquered world's princes. Queen Sivillith Anvora stood at the center of the viewing platform, her pale skin glowing with the soft blue bioluminescent markings that showed her royal bloodline. She was beautiful in the cold and distant way that all Volanthi royalty seemed to be, and she knew it well. "This one," she said, pointing a long finger toward a cage at the far end of the hall. "Bring him forward." The guards dragged the human male into the light, and the crowd murmured with interest. He was tall for his species, with dark hair and eyes that held no fear. Only a cold and calculating stillness that made several nobles step backward. "Kale Morrow," the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Captured during the 7th Resistance Uprising on Earth. He killed 17 of our soldiers before they brought him down, and he has survived 3 execution attempts in the prison camps." Sivillith walked closer to the cage, studying the human like one might study a dangerous animal at a menagerie. His body was covered in scars, and his wrists were raw from the chains, but he stood straight and met her gaze without looking away. "Why do you not kneel before your betters, human?" she asked, her voice carrying the musical quality of the Volanthi language. "I kneel to no one," Kale replied, his voice rough from disuse, but steady. The crowd gasped at his defiance, and several guards raised their shock lances, but Sivillith held up her hand to stop them. A smile played across her lips, the kind of smile a predator might give when it found particularly interesting prey. "I will take this one," she declared. "He will be my personal guard." Her advisor, an elderly Volanthi named Counselor Thales, stepped forward with concern written across his features. "Your Highness, this human is extremely dangerous. He's not suitable for palace service. I strongly recommend—" "I did not ask for your recommendation," Sivillith interrupted, never taking her eyes off Kale. "I want him because he is dangerous. What is the point of owning a beast if it has no teeth?" And so Kale Morrow, former sergeant of the Earth Resistance, became the property of the Princess Queen of the Volanthi Dominion. They fitted him with a neural compliance collar that first night, a band of cold metal that wrapped around his throat and connected directly to his nervous system. The technician explained its functions while Kale stood motionless. "Any attempt to harm your owner or disobey a direct command will result in immediate pain correction," the technician said, his tone bored as if he had given this speech 1,000 times before. "The collar can deliver 7 levels of correction. Level 1 is discomfort. Level 7 is death. Most humans do not survive past level 5. Kale said nothing. He simply filed the information away in his mind, the way he had filed away everything else since his capture. Guard rotations, weapon locations, structural weaknesses, names and faces of everyone who might one day be useful or dangerous. The Princess Queen's chambers were larger than the entire building where Kale had grown up on Earth. Golden light filtered through crystal windows, and the furniture was carved from wood that came from trees on worlds humanity would never see. It was obscene. This luxury built on the bones of conquered Peoples Ivlith reclined on a couch of deep purple fabric, watching her new acquisition with amusement. Several of her court ladies surrounded her, giggling behind their hands at the human standing stiffly by the door. "Come closer, pet," Sivillith commanded, and Kale felt the collar hum with readiness. He walked forward until he stood before her. "Meal." The collar sent a warning pulse through his body, and Kale's jaw tightened, but he lowered himself to his knees. The court ladies laughed, and one of them clapped her hands with delight. "Oh, he learns quickly," the lady exclaimed, "much smarter than my human. Mine still tries to run away." "Humans are clever creatures," Sivillith agreed, reaching out to grip Kale's chin and turn his face from side to side as if inspecting merchandise. "It is what makes them such useful servants." They can follow complex instructions, and some of them can even read. Tell me, pet, can you read? Yes, Kale answered, his voice flat. Yes, what? The caller pulsed again, and Kale forced the words out through gritted teeth. Yes, Your Highness. Good boy. Sivillith released him and leaned back with satisfaction. You will stand guard outside my chambers at night and accompany me during the day. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not look at other nobles unless given permission. You will remember at all times that you are property, and property does not have opinions or feelings. Do you understand? Yes, Your Highness. The days that followed fell into a routine of quiet humiliation. Kale stood behind Sivillith's throne during court functions while she made decisions that affected billions of lives across the Dominion. He walked 3 steps behind her through palace corridors, while nobles pointed and whispered about the princess, Queen's dangerous new pet she delighted in showing him off at dinner parties, making him perform small tasks to demonstrate his obedience. She would order him to fetch her wine or carry her, train or stand perfectly still for hours while her guests poked at him and asked questions about human biology. Is it true they only live for 70 or 80 years? One duchess asked, examining Kale like he was an unusual insect. Sometimes less. Sivillith replied with a laugh. They burn so bright and fast. It is almost sad, really. They barely have time to learn anything before they die. Kale remained silent through all of it, his face a mask of stone, but behind his eyes, his mind was always working. He memorized the layout of every room he entered. He learned the names and allegiances of every noble house. He studied the subtle tensions between factions and the whispered rumors of discontent at night. Standing guard outside the Princess Queen's chambers, he would watch the stars through the tall windows and find the distant point of light that was Earth's sun. Somewhere out there, his world still burned under Velanthi occupation. Somewhere out there, the resistance still fought. He thought about his wife, Mira, and his daughter, Lily. He thought about the day the orbital bombardment came, when fire fell from the sky and turned their city into ash. He thought about holding their bodies in the ruins and making a promise that he would never forget and never forgive. The Princess Queen had purchased him because she wanted a dangerous pet, something to show off to her friends and make herself feel powerful. She had no idea what she had truly brought into her home. She had brought 30 years of grief and rage compressed into human form. She had brought a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. She had brought the patience of someone who understood that revenge was not a moment but a process. And so Kale waited and watched and remembered every cruelty, every casual insult, every moment of suffering inflicted on his people. The Velanthi thought humans were simple creatures driven by simple emotions, but they had never understood the most dangerous thing about humanity. Humans could hate for a very, very long time. And Kale Morrow had learned to make his hatred as cold and patient as the void between stars. The void between stars. The void wind. To make his hatred as cold and patient as the void between stars. The Meru had Nanpil Morrow had learned to make his hatred as cold. Princess Queen smiled and laughed and thought herself in complete control, never realizing that she had invited a predator into her home, one who was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 6 months passed in the golden halls of the Imperial Palace, and Kale Morrow learned to move through his captivity like water flowing around stone. He did not fight the current, but neither did he let it sweep him away. The Princess Queen had grown comfortable with her human pet, comfortable enough to test the limits of his obedience in new and creative ways. She seemed to find genuine pleasure in discovering just how much he could endure. Tonight you will recite the history of human failures before my guests, she announced one evening, while her servants prepared her for a banquet. You will tell them about your pathetic rebellion and how easily we crushed it. Kale stood by the door, his face expressionless. "As you wish, Your Highness. I want you to show emotion this time," she added, turning to examine herself in a mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. "It bores me when you speak like a machine. Show them shame. Show them regret. Let them see that even you understand how inferior your species truly is." That night, Kale stood before a room full of Velanti nobles and spoke the words they wanted to hear. He told them about battles lost and cities burned. He told them about the death camps and the slave ships. He spoke of human suffering while the aliens sipped their wine and nodded with satisfaction. But when he caught his reflection in a polished silver plate, he saw his own eyes, and they were not filled with shame. They were cataloging every face in the room, every name, every weakness that might one day be useful. Lord Vithos Kethvori was there that night. A tall Velanti with silver markings that indicated his ancient and powerful bloodline. He watched Kale with an interest that was different from the others, more calculating, more aware. After the banquet, Sivillith retired to her chambers, pleased with the evening's entertainment. She did not notice that Kale had memorized the seating arrangement, the alliances visible and who spoke to whom, or the subtle tension between House Kethvori and the royal family. 3 weeks later, that knowledge saved her life and happened during a routine walk through the palace gardens. Sivillith was discussing trade policies with 2 of her advisors when Kale noticed movement in the flowering trees ahead. Movement that did not match the wind pattern. He did not think. He simply acted. Kale threw himself forward, tackling the Princess Queen to the ground as the first energy bolt sizzled through the air where her head had been. The advisors screamed and ran, but Kale was already moving, rolling to his feet and charging toward the assassins. There were 3 of them, dressed in the dark colors of servants, but carrying military-grade weapons that no servant could afford. Kale reached the first one before he could fire again, breaking his arm with a sharp twist and using his body as a shield. Against the second attacker's shots, the caller screamed in his mind, warning him that violence against any Velanti would trigger punishment. But these were not his masters. They were enemies of his master, and that small distinction gave him room to act. He killed the second assassin with the first one's weapon, a single shot through the throat. The third tried to run, but Kale was faster, catching him from behind and snapping his neck with a brutal efficiency that spoke of years of training. The whole encounter took less than 20 seconds. Palace guards arrived to find the Princess Queen on the ground, unharmed but shaking, surrounded by 3 dead Velanti and 1 human servant covered in blood that was not his own. Sivillith stared at Kale with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not amusement, not cruelty, but something that might have been shock mixed with a reluctant respect. "You saved my life," she said, her voice smaller than he had ever heard it. "I am your guard, Your Highness. It is my function." The investigation revealed that the assassins belonged to House Kethvori. Lord Vithos claimed ignorance and blamed rogue elements within his organization, but everyone knew the truth. The political fallout was significant, weakening the Kethvori faction and strengthening Sivillith's position at court as a reward for his service. Sivillith offered Kale a gift, any reasonable request within her power to grant. "I wish to access the palace archives," Kale said, kneeling before her throne as protocol demanded. "I wish to read," Sivillith laughed, delighted by what she perceived as a charmingly simple request. "You want to read our books? How adorable. Very well, you may visit the archives when you are not on duty. I am curious what a human mind makes of Velanti literature." She did not understand what she had given him. The archives contain not only literature, but history, military records, technical documents, and architectural plans. Kale spent every free moment there, absorbing information like a sponge, building a picture of the Dominion's strengths and weaknesses that no human had ever possessed. He also found something unexpected. Records of resistance cells still operating throughout Dominion space. Contacts and networks that the Volanti believed they had destroyed, but which still flickered with hidden life. One night, after a particularly long court session, Sivalith found Kale standing alone on a balcony overlooking the capital city. Millions of lights spread out below them, a testament to Volanti power and prosperity, all of it built on the labor of conquered peoples. "What are you looking at, pet?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. Kale pointed to a faint star near the horizon. "That is my sun, Your Highness. From here, Earth is nothing but a small point of light. You humans and your sentiment," Sivalith said with a dismissive wave. "Earth is a conquered world, nothing more. Why do you still care about it?" "My world still burns, Highness," Kale replied, his voice quiet but steady. "I simply want to remember the light." Something in his tone made Sivalith pause. For just a moment, she saw him not as a pet or a possession, but as something else, something she could not quite define. The feeling unsettled her, and she pushed it away with irritation. "Go back to your post," she commanded, "and do not waste your time with such foolish nostalgia. The past is dead. Only the present matters." "As you wish, Your Highness." But as Kale returned to his position outside her chambers, he carried with him a small data chip hidden in the lining of his sleeve, a chip containing communication frequencies for resistance cells operating on 17 different worlds. The past was not dead. It was waiting in the shadows of the palace. Lord Vithos watched the human god with renewed interest. His assassination attempt had failed, but perhaps there was another way to strike at the Princess Queen, through the very weapon she trusted to protect her a week later. Vithos arranged a private meeting with Kale in an unused section of the palace. The location was carefully chosen to avoid surveillance. "I know what you are," Vithos said, his silver markings glowing faintly in the dim light. "I have read the reports from Earth. You were not just a soldier. You were a leader, a strategist. Your people called you the Ghost of New Chicago." Kale remained silent, his face revealing nothing. "I can give you what you want," Vithos continued. "Freedom, a ship, weapons, resources. Help me remove Sivalith from power, and I will ensure that humans throughout the Dominion receive better treatment. I will ease the restrictions, reduce the quotas. Your people will suffer less, and in return, simply open a door at the right moment. Allow my agents access to the Princess Queen's chambers. You will not even have to raise a hand against her yourself." Kale considered the offer, or at least appeared to. Finally, he shook his head. No, Vithos's eyes narrowed. "You refuse freedom? You refuse to help your people?" "I refuse you," Kale said simply, and walked away. He did not explain his reasoning. He did not tell Vithos that freedom from one master only to serve another meant nothing. He did not reveal that he had already seen the records of how House Kethfori treated humans in their territory, worse even than the royal family, and he did not mention that his plans required patience, access, and position, all things that serving the Princess Queen provided. The game was long, and Kale Morrow had learned to play it very, very well. The Festival of Eternal Stars was the most important celebration in the Volanthi calendar, a week-long event that brought dignitaries from every corner of the Dominion to the Imperial Palace. It was a time for displays of power, political maneuvering, and entertainment that often came at the expense of the conquered Speciesivith had planned something special for this year's festival, something that would cement her reputation as both powerful and daring. She summoned Kale to her chambers 3 days before the celebration began. "You will fight in the arena," she announced, her eyes bright with anticipation. "A Thesek has been captured from the death world of Varus, and you will face it before the assembled nobles." Kale knew what a Thesek was. He had read about them in the archives, massive predators with armored hides, venomous claws, and a metabolism that allowed them to move with terrifying speed despite their size. Most creatures that faced the Thesek did not survive. Your Highness, Counselor Thales interjected with obvious concern. This human is valuable. He has proven his usefulness. Is it wise to risk him in such a manner? Risk is what makes it exciting, Sivlith replied with a wave of her hand. Besides, if he dies, I will simply acquire another. Humans are not exactly rare. She turned to Kale with a smile that expected gratitude. Consider this an honor, pet. No human has ever been given the chance to fight in the sacred arena. You should thank me. Thank you, Your Highness, Kale said. His voice flat the day of the fight arrived with all the ceremony the Volanti loved. Thousands of spectators filled the ancient arena, their bioluminescent markings creating a sea of shifting colors as they waited for the spectacle to begin. Kale stood in the preparation chamber beneath the arena floor, wearing only simple fighting clothes and carrying no weapons. The Thesek would also be unarmed. A creature like that needed no weapons. A guard approached with a small injector. Stimulants, human. They will help you last longer. The nobles prefer it when the entertainment does not end too quickly. Kale allowed the injection, feeling the drug surge through his system and sharpen his senses. He had 30 years of combat experience, but he had never faced anything like what waited for him above. The gates opened, and he walked into the light. The arena was a circle of white sand surrounded by towering walls of polished stone. Above, the nobles watched from their comfortable boxes, sipping drinks and placing bets on how long the human would survive. Sivilla sat in the royal box, her face eager with anticipation. Then the opposite gate opened, and the Thesek emerged. It was larger than Kale had expected, nearly 3 meters tall at the shoulder, with a body covered in overlapping plates of natural armor. Its 6 legs ended in claws that dripped with venom, and its head was dominated by a massive jaw filled with teeth designed for crushing bone. The creature saw Kale and roared, a sound that shook the walls of the arena and made several spectators cover their ears. Kale did not move for 30 seconds. He simply watched the Thesek as it circled him, studying its movements, the way it distributed its weight, the rhythm of its breathing. He remembered everything he had read about these creatures, their biology, their hunting patterns, their weaknesses. The Thesek charged. It was fast. Impossibly fast for something so large. But Kale had been watching for exactly this. He threw himself to the side at the last moment, rolling under the creature's snapping jaws and coming up behind its front legs. He had noticed something in those 30 seconds of observation. The Thesek favored its left side, suggesting an old injury that had never fully healed. Its armor plates were thick everywhere except for thin gaps at the joints, and it breathed in a specific pattern before each attack, telegraphing its movements. The creature spun, swiping at him with venomous claws, and Kale ducked under the blow. He grabbed a handful of sand and threw it into the Thesek's eyes. Buying himself a moment to move, the crowd murmured with surprise. They had expected the human to die in the first few seconds. Kale circled the blinded creature, staying just out of reach of its thrashing claws. He needed a weapon, and there was only one available: the arena itself. He ran toward the wall, and the Thesek followed, its hearing sharp enough to track him even with impaired vision. Kale timed his movement perfectly, leaping to the side as the creature crashed headfirst into the stone. The impact cracked one of its armor plates and dazed the beast for a precious few seconds. Kale moved without hesitation, climbing onto the creature's back and wrapping his arms around its neck. The Thesek bucked and roared, trying to throw him off, but Kale held on with the strength of desperation. He found the gap in the armor at the base of the skull and began to press, using all his weight to compress the vulnerable nerve cluster hidden there. The creature's movements became erratic, then weak, then still when Kale released his grip and slid off the massive body. The Thesek was dead. He had killed it in less than 2 minutes. The arena fell silent. No one moved, No one spoke. Thousands of Volanthi stared at the human standing over the corpse of a creature that was supposed to be unstoppable. Kale was bleeding from several wounds where the creature's claws had grazed him, and his arms shook with exhaustion. But he stood straight and met their stares without flinching. Then the cheering began, not for Kale, but for Sivillith, who had provided such magnificent entertainment. Nobles rushed to congratulate her on owning such an exceptional specimen. Her status at court rose significantly that day, but Sivillith herself sat frozen in her box, watching her human guard with an expression she could not hide. For the first time, she truly understood what she had brought into her home that night. She summoned Kale to her private chambers, dismissing all her servants and guards. She sat on the edge of her bed, and for once, she did not look like a princess queen. She looked like someone who had seen something that frightened her. "Sit," she commanded. Pointing to a chair across from her, Kale sat, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his bandaged wounds. "Who are you?" Sivillith asked, her voice quiet. Who were you before we captured you?" "The auctioneer said you were a resistance fighter, but that cannot be all. I have seen soldiers fight. I have never seen anyone do what you did today." For a long moment, Kale said nothing. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He told her about the human resistance, about the guerrilla war that had raged for 30 years across Earth's surface. He told her about the burning cities and the death camps, about experiments conducted on human prisoners to test the limits of pain and endurance. He told her about the day the orbital bombardment came, when Volanthi warships appeared in the sky above New Chicago and began to rain fire down upon the civilian population. He told her about a woman named Myra and a girl named Lily, about finding their bodies in the rubble of their home. "Your father ordered that bombardment," Kale said, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "The Emperor himself signed the command that killed my wife and daughter." Sivillith's face paled, her bioluminescent markings flickering with distress. "I did not know." "You did not want to know," Kale interrupted. "It is easier not to know. Easier to see us as pets and beasts, rather than people who love and grieve and remember." He leaned forward, and for the first time, Sivillith saw something beyond the mask of the obedient servant. She saw rage, ancient and cold and patient. "You asked me once why I refused Lord Vithos's offer," Kale continued. "Why I did not take his bargain for freedom. It is because freedom means nothing if the Dominion still stands. And because you are not the one I hate most in this palace." The implication hung in the air between them. The Emperor, Sivillith's father, was the true target of Kale's hatred. "Get out," Sivillith whispered, her voice shaking. "Get out of my chambers now." Kale rose and bowed with perfect formality. "As you wish, Your Highness." He left, and Sivillith sat alone in the darkness, thinking about conquered worlds and burning cities, and a human who had lost everything and still waited, still watched, still planned for the first time in her 200 years of privileged existence. The Princess Queen of the Volanthi Dominion could not sleep. She had seen something true that night, something ugly, and she could not unsee it. 3 weeks after the Festival of Eternal Stars, the Emperor's health began to fail rapidly. The ancient ruler had reigned for over 1,000 years, and his body was finally surrendering to time. Physicians rushed through the palace corridors, and the noble houses began to position themselves for the coming power struggle. The succession conclave was called, a gathering of all major houses to formally recognize Sivillith as the sole ruler of the Dominion. It should have been a ceremony of unity, but Lord Vithos Kethvori had other plans. Kale knew something was wrong the moment he entered the great hall on the night of the conclave. The guards were positioned differently than usual, and several servants he did not recognize moved through the crowd. His instincts, honed by decades of guerrilla warfare, screamed warnings. He tried to reach Sivillith, to warn her. but she was already seated on the ceremonial throne beside her dying father, surrounded by nobles offering their pledges of loyalty. Kale took his position near the door, his body tense with readiness. The attack came without warning. A high-pitched frequency suddenly filled the hall, inaudible to Volanthi ears, but devastating to the neural compliance collars worn by every human servant in the palace. Kale collapsed to his knees as white-hot agony exploded through his nervous system, his vision blurring and his muscles seizing all around him. Other human servants fell, writhing in pain or lying motionless. The frequency was designed to incapacitate them all, to remove any possibility of human interference. Then the doors burst open, and Vithas's soldiers poured into the great hall. The fighting was brief and one-sided. The royal guards were outnumbered and caught by surprise, and Vithos had planned his coup carefully. Within minutes, the loyal nobles were subdued or killed, and the princess queen was dragged from her throne and thrown to the floor before Vithos, the old emperor, watched from his chair, too weak to move, as his daughter was forced to her knees. "The Amvora dynasty ends tonight," Vithos declared, his voice ringing through the hall. "Your family has ruled for too long, grown too soft, too complacent. Under my leadership, the Dominion will return to its former glory." He circled Civilith like a predator savoring its prey. "Your father's generation conquered the humans, that they should have exterminated them entirely. Instead, they kept them as slaves and pets, allowing them to breed and multiply. The human problem grows worse every year, and your family does nothing." Civilith spat at his feet. "You are a traitor and a coward. The other houses will never accept you. The other houses will accept whoever holds power," Vithas replied with a cold smile. "And once you and your father are dead, that will be me. But do not worry, I plan to make your death educational. I want everyone to see what happens to those who stand against House Kethvari." He turned to look at Kale, still writhing on the ground near the door. "And your precious human pet will watch every moment. Perhaps that will teach him the cost of refusing my generous offer." Vithas walked over to Kale and kicked him in the ribs. "Look at him, this legendary warrior, this ghost of New Chicago. Now he is nothing but a convulsing animal. So much for human strength." What Vithas did not know, what no one knew, was that Kale had spent months secretly modifying his compliance collar. He had used materials stolen from the archives and maintenance systems, working in the darkness of his tiny sleeping quarters to make careful adjustments. He could not remove the collar without killing himself, but he had found a way to temporarily override its pain limiters, had never tested it. He had been saving it for the right moment. This was the moment Kale gritted his teeth and activated the override. The pain did not disappear, in fact. It intensified, flooding every nerve in his body with agony that should have rendered him unconscious. But instead of surrendering to it, he used it, channeling the sensation into fuel for movement. His hand shot out and grabbed Vithos's ankle, yanking the lord off balance. Vithos fell with a startled cry, and Kale was already moving. Rolling to his feet despite the collar's screaming protests, the room went silent with shock. "Impossible," Vithos gasped. Scrambling backward, the frequency should... Kale did not give him time to finish. He grabbed the nearest guard's shock lance and drove it through the man's throat, then spun to face the next attacker. What followed was not a battle. It was a demonstration of what humans were truly capable of when all restraint was abandoned. Kale moved through Vithos's soldiers like a storm made flesh. Every strike was lethal, every movement efficient. He used their own weapons against them, picking up and discarding blades and lances as each one broke or was knocked away. He fought with fists and elbows and teeth when he had to. The Volanthi were taller, stronger, longer lived, but they had never learned to fight like this. Their wars were conducted with ships and technology, their soldiers trained for discipline and formation. They had no experience facing a human who fought like a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. Kale took wounds. A blade sliced across his shoulder. An energy bolt grazed his hip. A desperate slash opened a gash on his forehead. But he did not slow down. The collar sent wave after wave of crippling pain through his body. But he had learned to live with pain long ago. The nobles who had supported the coup broke and ran. The soldiers who remained fought with increasing desperation as they realized they were facing something they did not understand. 30 years of grief and rage poured out of Cale Morrow in those terrible minutes. He thought of Myra and Lily, of burning cities and death camps, of every humiliation he had endured in the Princess Queen's service. He let it all fuel him, burning through his body like fire. Finally, only Vithas remained. The Lord had retreated to the far end of the hall, his silver markings dim with terror, his hands raised in surrender. "Wait," Vithas pleaded, his voice breaking. "I can give you anything. Wealth, power, freedom. I can end human slavery across my territories. Just spare me." Cale walked toward him, blood dripping from dozens of wounds, his breathing ragged but his eyes clear. The collar was approaching its critical threshold in seconds. It would deliver a lethal surge. "You offered me a deal once," Cale said, his voice hoarse with pain. "I refused. Do you know why?" Vithas shook his head, too frightened to speak. "Because you would have been worse. Because under your rule, my people would have suffered even more. I read the records of your territories, Vithas. I know what you do to humans there." He reached the Lord and grabbed him by the throat. "My wife and daughter died because of your kind. I have waited 30 years for this moment. Did you really think I would trade their memory for your empty promises?" Vithas tried to speak, to beg, to bargain, but Cale was done listening. He twisted sharply, and the Lord's neck snapped with a sound that echoed through the silent hall. The collar's failsafe triggered. Cale felt a lethal surge begin, felt his heart stutter and his vision darken, and then there was a blast of energy, and the collar shattered. Pieces of metal falling away from his throat, he collapsed to the ground, gasping, and looked up to see Sivillith standing over him with a smoking weapon in her hand. She had grabbed it from a fallen guard and shot the collar off his neck at the last possible moment. Her hand trembled, and her face was pale, and she looked at Cale with an expression he could not read. "You saved me," she whispered. Her voice shaking. Cale tried to respond, but the world was fading, his body finally surrendering to the damage it had taken. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the Princess Queen kneeling beside him, calling for physicians, her hands pressing against his wounds as if she could hold his life. Inside his broken body by will alone, for the first time since he had become her slave. She touched him not as a master handling property, but as one person trying to save another. Cale Morrow woke in a bed softer than anything he had ever known, surrounded by medical equipment that hummed with quiet efficiency. His body was wrapped in healing membranes, and a gentle warmth spread through his limbs where the Volanthi physicians had repaired the worst of the damage. He was alive, though he was not sure how. The neural damage from the collar should have been fatal. A figure sat beside his bed, reading from a data tablet. Sivillith looked different than he remembered, smaller somehow, less certain. She wore simple clothes instead of her usual finery, and her bioluminescent markings were dim with exhaustion. "The physicians say you will recover," she said without looking up from her tablet, "though you will have chronic pain for the rest of your life, and your left arm will never regain full sensation." The neural damage was extensive. Cale tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Sivillith set down her tablet and helped him drink from a cup of cool water. "My father died during the night," she continued, her voice carefully controlled. The stress of the coup was too much for his weakened heart. "I am now sole ruler of the Volanthi Dominion." She paused, finally meeting his eyes. "The nobles are calling what you did, Kalmora. It translates roughly as wrath beyond death. They are terrified of you. Some have called for your execution, claiming you are too dangerous to live." Others want to study you, to understand how a human could possibly do what you did. And what do you want, your majesty? Kale asked, his voice a ragged whisper. Sivillith was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, uncertain in a way he had never heard before. I have been thinking about what you told me. About the bombardment that killed your family. About the things my people have done to yours. I always knew, in an abstract way, that we had conquered other species. But I never... She stopped, struggling to find the right words. I never thought about what it meant. I never considered that the humans I saw as pets and servants had lives and loves and families that we destroyed. I was raised to believe we were superior, that our rule was right and natural, and I never questioned it. She rose and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. My father is dead, and I am now responsible for an empire that was built on cruelty. I can continue as my ancestors did, or I can try to change things. The question is whether change is even possible. Kale pushed himself up in the bed, ignoring the protests of his damaged body. You are asking me for advice? I am asking you what you want, Sivillith replied, turning to face him. I am offering you freedom. A ship, supplies, coordinates to human refugee colonies beyond Dominion space. You can leave, find your people, never think about us again. After everything we have done to you, no one would blame you for wanting nothing more than escape. She walked back to his bedside and held out a data chip. Everything you need is on this. Just say the word, and you will be free. Kale looked at the chip in her hand, at the offer of freedom he had dreamed about for 30 years. He thought about the refugee colonies, about the possibility of peace and rest, about spending whatever remained of his life surrounded by his own kind. Then he thought about the millions of humans, still enslaved across the Dominion, about the suffering that would continue whether he was here or not, about the faint possibility that something could actually change. No, he said, Sivillith's eyes widened. You refuse? After everything. Kale reached into the pocket of his medical gown and withdrew a small data chip, the same chip he had been carrying for months, the one containing everything he had learned in the archives. You asked me once why I watch everything, he said, pressing the chip into her palm. I was waiting for the right moment, the moment when someone in power might actually listen. Sivillith looked at the chip with confusion. What is this? Everything I compiled about the Dominion's treatment of humans. The inefficiencies of the slave economy, the resources wasted on suppression and control, the brewing rebellions on 17 different worlds. Not a threat, an opportunity. He met her eyes, and for the first time, he spoke to her not as a slave to a master, but as one person to another. Your empire is rotting from within, Majesty. You can spend your reign fighting the inevitable, trying to hold together a system that is collapsing under its own cruelty. Or you can be the one who changes it. He leaned back against the pillows, suddenly exhausted. I have seen what your people can do at their worst. I watched my world burn. But I have also seen you, the person who shot the collar off my neck, who sat beside my bed instead of letting me die. I think there might be something better in you. Something that your upbringing tried to kill, but could not quite destroy. Sivillith stared at him for a long moment, the data chip clutched in her hand. You believe I could change things? After 200 years of accepting everything my family stood for? I believe you have a choice, Kale replied. The same choice everyone has. You can be what you were raised to be, or you can be something else. It will not be easy, and many will resist, and you may fail. But at least you will have tried. And if I do try, if I attempt these reforms, you would stay. You would help me? I have knowledge and skills that could be useful, Kale said simply. And I have learned that revenge alone is not enough to sustain a life. My wife and daughter are dead, and nothing will bring them back. But if I can help build a future where other human families do not suffer as mine did, then perhaps their deaths will have meaning. He paused. a ghost of a smile crossing his scarred face. Besides, someone needs to keep you from making foolish decisions. You still have much to learn about humans. 1 year later, the emancipation reforms were announced to a stunned Dominion. The changes came gradually: the abolition of the compliance collars, the establishment of basic rights for human workers, the closing of the worst labor camps, the creation of paths to citizenship for those who had served the Dominion faithfully. They were met with fierce resistance from conservative noble houses. But Queen Sivillith proved to be a more formidable ruler than anyone had expected. She had a secret weapon, an advisor who seemed to anticipate every move against her, who knew the weaknesses of every noble house, who understood both human and Volanti psychology in ways that made him invaluable. Kale Morrow stood beside the throne now, not as a guard or a slave, but as the voice of humanity, a position created specifically for him. The first human to hold official rank in the Dominion's government. He wore no collar around his neck, only a thin scar where the metal had once been. At his hip hung a blade of Volanti steel. A gift from the Queen. A visiting diplomat from a distant empire studied him with barely concealed suspicion during an audience. "Your Majesty, if I may be so bold, why do you keep a human so close to power?" Many of my colleagues find it concerning. Sivillith smiled, and for a moment her expression carried something she had learned from Kale, the look of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. "Because, Ambassador, I have learned that humans are not pets to be kept or beasts to be feared. They are forces of nature, and I would rather have that force beside me than against me." The diplomat glanced at Kale, who stood motionless and silent, his scarred face revealing nothing. "And if his people decide they want more than reforms? If they want complete freedom, independence, revenge for what was done to them, then we will deal with that when it comes," Sivillith replied. "But change must start somewhere. My ancestors built an empire on conquest and cruelty, and it has brought us nothing but instability and endless war. Perhaps it is time to try something different." After the audience ended and the diplomat departed, Sivillith turned to Kale. "Do you think he believed any of that?" "No," Kale replied, "but it does not matter what he believes. It matters what we do." He walked to the window, looking out at the capital city where humans now walked freely in certain districts, where the first mixed schools were opening, where the long work of reconciliation had barely begun. It would take generations to undo the damage of conquest, and many would resist every step of the way. But for the first time in 30 years, Kale Morrow allowed himself something he had thought lost forever. Hope. Not hope for himself. He knew his life would likely end in violence, protecting the Queen from the endless enemies her reforms had created. But hope for the future, for human children who might grow up knowing something other than slavery. For a galaxy that might one day see his species as equals. He thought of Mira and Lily, and he hoped that wherever they were, they would understand. He had chosen to stay not out of forgiveness for what the Volanti had done, but out of a belief that the best revenge was not destruction. The best revenge was building something better from the ashes behind him. Queen Sivillith reviewed reports on the day's business, occasionally asking for his input in a voice that held no trace of the arrogant princess who had once made him kneel for her amusement. They had both changed, both grown, both become something neither could have predicted. The Princess Queen, who had taunted her human guard, had learned the true meaning of power, not dominion over others, but responsibility for them, and the human, who had unleashed his wrath, had discovered that there were things worth fighting for beyond vengeance together. They would reshape the galaxy, one difficult day at a time,